The descent from confidence to desperation accelerated through the winter of 1944 into the spring of 1945. What had begun as strategic setbacks transformed into systematic annihilation. American forces were no longer merely winning battles. They were erasing Japanese military capability with methodical thoroughness that suggested unlimited resources and infinite patience. Every Japanese stronghold that fell revealed the same pattern: overwhelming firepower, inexhaustible supplies, and a willingness to expend material resources on a scale that Japanese commanders found psychologically incomprehensible. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Iwo Jima provided the template for this new phase of the war. The island measured barely 8 square miles, a volcanic rock in the middle of the Pacific with 3 airfields and no strategic value except as a stepping stone toward Japan. Lieutenant General Tadanichi Kuribayashi, commanding the defense, had prepared with meticulous care. His 21,000 troops had dug 11 miles of tunnels, positioned artillery in camouflaged bunkers, created a defensive network designed to extract maximum casualties from any assault. Kuribayashi understood he could not win. His mission was to make the Americans pay such a horrific price that they would reconsider their advance. The American response demonstrated why such calculations were futile. For 3 days before the invasion, Navy vessels and aircraft pounded Iwo Jima with explosives on a scale that seemed designed to obliterate the island itself. 22,000 shells from battleships and cruisers, thousands of bombs from carrier aircraft. The bombardment consumed more ammunition than Japan had expended in some entire campaigns. Then 70,000 Marines landed with support from hundreds of ships and thousands of aircraft. The battle lasted 36 days and cost nearly 7,000 American lives. These casualties were mourned in America, reported extensively in newspapers, and would haunt veterans for the rest of their lives. But from a strategic perspective, the losses barely registered. The Marines who died on Iwo Jima were replaced by new troops in training camps across America. The ships and aircraft supporting the invasion continued operations without pause. American military capability was not degraded by the battle. If anything, the capture of Iwo Jima enhanced American offensive potential by providing an emergency landing site for damaged bombers returning from Japan. Captain Tsunetsu Wachi, serving in the Navy Ministry, compiled after-action reports from Iwo Jima and found himself struggling to write analysis that would not be dismissed as defeatist. The Americans had suffered significant casualties by their standards, yet they had treated the battle as routine. No operational pause followed. No strategic reconsideration occurred. American forces simply continued their advance as if the battle had been a minor inconvenience. This was the true horror. Not that America could absorb such losses, but that they could absorb them and continue attacking without missing a beat. Japanese forces, by contrast, had lost 21,000 men at Iwo Jima who could not be replaced. These were trained soldiers, many with combat experience, defending prepared positions with adequate supplies. Their destruction represented not just tactical defeat, but strategic evaporation of irreplaceable assets. Japan had perhaps 2 million men under arms across all theaters, but most were scattered across islands and territories now cut off from support. The troops capable of defending the home islands numbered in the hundreds of thousands, declining with each battle.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Similar tactics to those used at Iwo Jima, trading space for time, inflicting maximum casualties, making the Americans pay for every yard. The battle lasted 82 days, cost 12,000 American lives, and ended with virtually the entire Japanese garrison dead or captured. Admiral Matomi Ugaki, observing from headquarters in Kyushu,
watched Okinawa's fall with growing despair. American casualties were again significant, the highest of any Pacific campaign. Yet American forces showed no sign of weakening. If anything, their operations were becoming more efficient. Supplies flowed endlessly from ships offshore. Artillery support was immediate and devastating. Air cover was continuous and overwhelming. Medical evacuation was so rapid that wounded Americans reached hospital ships within hours. The contrast with Japanese operations, where wounded soldiers often died from lack of basic medical care, was almost obscene. The kamikaze campaign that accompanied the Okinawa battle represented both Japanese desperation and a grim acceptance of reality. Unable to contest American naval power through conventional means, Japanese forces had resorted to using pilots as guided missiles, flying explosive-laden aircraft directly into American ships. This was not tactics or strategy. This was organizational suicide, the consumption of remaining assets in gestures that achieved tactical success but strategic irrelevance. Over 1,900 kamikaze sorties were flown during the Okinawa campaign, sinking 36 ships and damaging hundreds more. These were real achievements, causing genuine American casualties and demonstrating that Japanese forces retained capacity for lethal attacks. But the strategic calculation remained unchanged. Japan lost 1,900 pilots, their aircraft, and any hope of reconstituting an effective air force. America lost some ships from a fleet of thousands, mourned the dead, and continued operations without meaningful degradation of capability. Vice Admiral Matomi Ugaki, who would himself die leading a kamikaze attack after Japan's surrender, understood the mathematical futility better than most. He wrote in his diary that kamikaze tactics represented not a path to victory, but acknowledgement of defeat. Conventional operations required trained pilots who could survive to fly again, well-maintained aircraft that would return to base, coordinated tactics that preserved force strength. Kamikaze attacks consumed everything in single-use strikes. This was the strategy of a force that had already lost and knew it. The human cost of this realization was crushing. Pilots selected for kamikaze missions were often young men with minimal training, volunteers or assignees facing certain death. Many wrote farewell letters expressing doubts they could never voice publicly. They understood their sacrifice would not change the outcome. They knew Japan was losing, yet military culture demanded they smile, proclaim dedication to the emperor, and fly off to die. The psychological torture of dying for a cause you knew was already lost represented a special category of suffering. Lieutenant Yukio Seki, who led the first organized kamikaze attack in October 1944, exemplified this tragedy. Seki was an experienced pilot, recently married, with no illusions about the war's trajectory. When informed of his selection for the Special Attack Unit, he reportedly said that his death would be meaningless, that Japan had already lost. Nevertheless, he led the attack, sank an escort carrier, and died at age 23. His final letters reveal a man who understood the futility of his sacrifice, but could find no honorable alternative within the system that had shaped him. The home islands themselves were experiencing the collapse of illusion as American bombers ranged freely across Japanese skies. Major General Curtis LeMay, commanding the 21st Bomber Command, had recognized that Japanese cities were uniquely vulnerable to incendiary attack. Most urban construction used wood and paper. Buildings were densely packed. Fire departments were primitive by Western standards. LeMay had ordered a campaign of systematic firebombing that would kill more Japanese civilians in 6 months than the atomic bombs would kill at Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined.
The first major firebombing raid struck Tokyo on the night of March 9–10, 1945. Over 300 B-29 superfortresses dropped nearly 2,000 tons of incendiaries on the most densely populated area of the city. The resulting firestorm killed an estimated 100,000 people in a single night, destroyed 16 square miles of urban area, and left over 1 million residents homeless. This was not collateral damage from military targets. This was deliberate destruction of civilian areas intended to break Japanese will to resist. Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki, viewing damage reports from Tokyo, found himself confronting questions that Japanese political leadership had avoided for years. How could a nation protect its population when enemy bombers operated with impunity? How could a government justify continued resistance when every day brought more destruction and death? How could military leaders promise eventual victory when the enemy demonstrated daily that they could destroy Japan at will? The answer was that they could not, but admitting this required abandoning the foundational myths of Japanese nationalism. The government had told its people that Americans were weak, that Japanese spirit would prevail, that the emperor's divine protection ensured victory. Every burned city, every lost island, every military defeat contradicted these assurances. Acknowledging the lies meant discrediting the entire political and military establishment. So the lies continued even as cities burned and civilians died in numbers that exceeded military casualties. Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo, one of the few senior officials willing to discuss peace negotiations, faced opposition from military leaders who insisted that Japan could still achieve acceptable terms through continued resistance. Army Minister Kurichika Anami argued that American casualties at Iwo Jima and Okinawa demonstrated that Japan could inflict sufficient losses to force negotiation. Navy Minister Mitsumasa Yonai countered that American industrial capacity meant they could absorb such casualties indefinitely while Japan was being systematically destroyed. These debates occurred while American submarines had effectively ended Japanese maritime commerce. By spring 1945, merchant shipping between Japan and the Asian mainland had been reduced to a trickle. Oil imports had ceased almost entirely. Food shipments from Taiwan and Korea were irregular and insufficient. The home islands were being starved while possessing territories throughout Asia that held abundant resources. American submarines had accomplished what Japanese forces had never managed against Allied shipping, severing the maritime connections that made an island nation viable. Captain Atsushi Oi, the logistics officer who had tried to warn of American productive capacity, now found himself managing an impossible situation. Japanese industry was collapsing not from physical destruction alone, but from lack of raw materials. Steel mills sat idle for lack of iron ore and coal. Aircraft factories reduced production for want of aluminum and copper. What ships remained in Japanese ports could not sail for lack of fuel. The empire had not been defeated through loss of territory or military setbacks, but through systematic severing of the logistical networks that sustained industrial society. The contrast with American logistics had become almost surreal. American forces fighting in the Philippines, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa received better supplies than many Japanese troops stationed in the home islands. American soldiers ate fresh food, received mail regularly, enjoyed recreational facilities, and possessed more ammunition than they could expend. Japanese soldiers survived on reduced rations, went weeks without letters from home, lacked basic medical supplies, and hoarded ammunition against the day when it would run out entirely. This disparity existed despite American forces operating thousands of miles from their industrial base, while Japanese forces defended their homeland. The explanation was organizational rather than geographical. American logistics treated supply as warfare by other means, a systematic application of industrial capacity to military needs. Japanese logistics was improvised, reactive, and increasingly dysfunctional as the transportation network collapsed under submarine assault and bombing. Lieutenant Commander Haruki Iki, serving on a destroyer in home waters, experienced this dysfunction personally. His ship spent weeks in port, unable to sail for lack of fuel. When fuel finally arrived, it was of such poor quality that engine performance suffered. Spare parts were unavailable. Food provisions were inadequate. Sailors were going hungry while defending their own coastline. Meanwhile, Iki watched American task forces operate offshore with apparent logistical ease. Their ships maneuvered freely, their aircraft flew constantly, their operations suggested unlimited fuel and supplies. The psychological impact of watching enemy forces operate with such abundance while Japanese forces struggled with basic necessities cannot be overstated. This was not defeat in glorious battle. This was defeat through organizational superiority, logistics, industrial capacity, and systematic management. Japanese forces were being starved, bombed, and blockaded into submission by an enemy who barely seemed to be straining. American casualties were mourned in their country, but American operations continued without pause. This was what total war looked like when one side possessed effectively unlimited resources. Admiral Soemo Toyoda, who had dismissed early warnings about American capacity, now confronted daily evidence of his miscalculation. Intelligence reports documented American preparations for invasion of the home islands. The forces being assembled made previous operations look modest by comparison. Millions of troops, thousands of ships, tens of thousands of aircraft. The Americans were preparing to apply their industrial advantage directly to Japanese soil, with force levels that would overwhelm any possible defense. Japanese military planners estimated that defending against invasion would cost millions of lives, military and civilian combined. Some generals spoke of making Japan into a fortress, fighting block by block, making every city into Iwo Jima multiplied 1,000-fold. Others quietly suggested this would simply result in Japan's complete destruction without altering the outcome. The debate was not about winning, but about how much suffering would precede inevitable defeat. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the Pearl Harbor attack and survived the entire war despite numerous close calls, found himself reflecting on how completely Japanese calculations had failed. The attack on Pearl Harbor had been designed to cripple American Pacific naval power, buying Japan time to consolidate conquests before American industrial might could be brought to bear. The plan had assumed America would negotiate rather than fight a prolonged war to reconquer distant territories. Every assumption had proven catastrophically wrong. America had not negotiated. American industrial mobilization had been faster and more complete than Japanese planners imagined possible. The time purchased at Pearl Harbor had been measured in months, not years, and during that time, America had built a military machine that dwarfed anything Japan could produce. Fuchida understood that the war had been lost on December 7, 1941, not through military defeat, but through strategic misconception. Japan had attacked a nation it fundamentally misunderstood, assuming limitations that did not exist. The final months of the war saw Japanese leadership paralyzed between the impossibility of victory and the unacceptability of surrender. Military leaders insisted that national honor required fighting to the last Japanese life. Civilian officials increasingly recognized that such a course meant genocide. The emperor himself, traditionally above politics, intervened to end the debate and bring about surrender. Understanding that the military strategy led to nothing more than Japanese self-annihilation,
Political debate began making discreet inquiries about peace possibilities. But institutional inertia and military culture made any organized surrender nearly impossible to arrange. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki on August 6 and 9, 1945, broke this paralysis not through the immediate casualties, horrific though they were, but through revealing yet another dimension of American power. The United States possessed weapons of apocalyptic destructive capability and the willingness to use them. American scientists had achieved what Japanese nuclear research suggested was theoretically impossible for decades. America could now destroy entire cities with single bombs delivered by single aircraft. Admiral Soemu Toyoda's initial reaction to reports of Hiroshima's destruction revealed the depth of institutional denial that had characterized Japanese leadership throughout the war. He suggested the reports must be exaggerated, that perhaps a large conventional bomb had struck an ammunition depot, causing secondary explosions. Even after confirmation that a single bomb had destroyed an entire city, Some military leaders argued for continued resistance. If America possessed only a few such weapons, they suggested, Japan could endure their use and continue fighting. This reasoning exemplified the psychological trap Japanese leadership had created. No level of destruction was sufficient to justify surrender because surrender itself was psychologically impossible. Officers had been trained their entire careers that death was preferable to capitulation. Accepting defeat meant acknowledging that this training was wrong, that the sacrifice of hundreds of thousands had been pointless, that the entire war had been a catastrophic mistake. For many, continued fighting seemed easier than confronting these realizations. The Soviet declaration of war on August 8th and their invasion of Manchuria destroyed the last hope of negotiated peace. Japanese diplomats had been attempting to use Soviet mediation to achieve terms more favorable than unconditional surrender. Soviet entry into the war eliminated this possibility while simultaneously demonstrating that Japan now faced enemies on all sides, with no prospect of relief. The strategic situation was not merely hopeless, but absurd. Continued resistance would achieve nothing except prolonging suffering. Even then, agreement to surrender required the personal intervention of Emperor Hirohito, whose August 15th radio address to the Japanese people represented the first time most Japanese had heard his voice. His statement that the war situation had developed, not necessarily to Japan's advantage, was perhaps history's greatest understatement. Japan had lost over 3 million people, military and civilian. Its cities were ruins. Its economy had collapsed. Its empire was gone. The Americans had demonstrated they could destroy Japan completely if resistance continued. The surrender announcement provoked attempted coups by military officers unwilling to accept defeat. These attempts failed not because the conspirators lacked determination, but because most officers recognized that continuing the war meant Japan's extinction. The choice was not between victory and defeat. That choice had been made years earlier through strategic miscalculation and industrial disparity. The choice now was between accepting defeat or dying pointlessly. Even warriors devoted to death before dishonor could see that dying would not preserve honor, but simply eliminate the Japanese people. Captain Toshikazu Omai, whose reports on American shipbuilding had been dismissed as defeatist in 1944, found himself vindicated in the most bitter way possible. His figures had been conservative. American production had exceeded even his pessimistic projections. The final accounting revealed that America had built over 150 fleet and escort carriers during the war, produced nearly 300,000 aircraft, manufactured over 6 million trucks and jeeps, built thousands of ships, and supplied not only its own forces, but provided massive aid to Britain, the Soviet Union, and other allies. The statistics were so overwhelming that they seemed fictional. American steel production during the war years totaled over 300 million tons. American oil production exceeded 7 billion barrels. American factories had produced enough artillery shells that if distributed evenly across every square mile of enemy territory, the density would have been lethal. This was not war as Japanese leaders had understood it. This was industrial capacity weaponized, an entire continental economy devoted to military production, with results that exceeded anything in human history. Japanese production statistics, compiled after the war, revealed the true extent of the mismatch. Japan's total aircraft production from 1941 to 1945 was approximately 70,000 aircraft. America had produced that many aircraft in 1944 alone. Japanese merchant shipping totaled 6 million tons at peak. America had built 19 million tons in a single year. For every Japanese fighter manufactured, America built 4. For every Japanese ship, America built 10. The numerical advantage had been overwhelming from the start and had only grown as the war progressed. More disturbing than the numbers themselves was what they revealed about Japanese strategic thinking. Military planners had known America possessed superior industrial capacity. This was not secret information. The question had been whether industrial advantage could overcome Japanese tactical superiority, better training, and willingness to accept casualties.
The answer was that industrial advantage was not merely important, but determinative. Quality was meaningless against overwhelming quantity. Spirit could not defeat production lines. Courage was irrelevant when the enemy possessed effectively unlimited resources. Lieutenant Commander Masatake Okumiya, who had witnessed American material superiority at Rabaul, spent years after the war analyzing how Japanese leadership had so completely misunderstood their opponent. His conclusion was that Japanese decision-makers had confused tactical capability with strategic capacity. Japan could defeat American forces in individual battles. Japanese pilots were better trained in 1941. Japanese ships were often superior designs. Japanese soldiers were arguably more disciplined. But these tactical advantages were trivial compared to America's ability to build, supply, and sustain forces on a scale Japan could never match. The fundamental error was philosophical. Japanese military culture emphasized individual excellence, small unit effectiveness, tactical virtuosity. American military culture emphasized systems, logistics, industrial capacity, organizational efficiency. The Japanese approach produced superb warriors. The American approach produced victorious armies. When these philosophies collided, the outcome was predetermined. Warriors might win battles, but systems won wars. Post-war interviews with senior Japanese officers revealed remarkable consistency in their assessments. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's prediction that Japan could run wild for 6 months to a year before American power asserted itself had been eerily accurate. The strategic initiative had peaked with the Battle of Midway in June 1942. Every subsequent engagement had been defensive, reactive, increasingly desperate. By 1943, Japanese forces were fighting not to win, but to delay. By 1944, they were fighting not to delay, but simply to survive. By 1945, they were fighting because stopping required admitting the entire enterprise had been futile. Admiral Soimu Toyoda, in post-war testimony, acknowledged that he had received accurate intelligence about American industrial capacity, but had not believed it. The figures seemed impossible. No nation could produce at such rates while maintaining civilian economy and supporting allies overseas. Toyota had assumed the reports were propaganda, inflated to damage Japanese morale. Learning after the war that the figures had been conservative rather than exaggerated represented a final humiliation. Japan had underestimated the scale of the U.S. industrial ability and technological innovations during the war period.
Not merely lost to a superior opponent, they had lost to an opponent whose superiority they refused to acknowledge until destruction forced recognition. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, whose shocked recognition of American carrier strength had triggered this entire examination, survived the war and lived until 1977. In interviews during the 1950s and 1960s, he spoke candidly about the moment at Leyte Gulf when he understood Japan had lost. Seeing 16 American carriers where intelligence had suggested 6, knowing that more carriers were operating elsewhere, comprehending that these vessels represented only a fraction of American naval power, the recognition had been physically painful, a feeling like falling from a great height with the ground rushing up. The human cost of Japan's strategic miscalculation extended beyond military casualties to encompass an entire generation scarred by futile sacrifice. Pilots who survived kamikaze missions because of mechanical failure lived with survivor's guilt and the knowledge that their deaths would have achieved nothing. Soldiers who fought on bypassed islands until starvation forced surrender endured years of captivity knowing their suffering had been pointless. Sailors who watched their ships sink from overwhelming American firepower carried memories of friends dying for a cause that was already lost. Captain Mitsuo Fuchida, the Pearl Harbor attack leader, spent decades after the war reflecting on what Japan could have done differently. His conclusion was that the entire strategy had been flawed from inception. Attacking America had been gambling on American unwillingness to fight rather than inability. When Americans proved willing to accept casualties and mobilize completely, Japan had no answer. The only rational strategy would have been avoiding war with America entirely, focusing on consolidating gains in Asia, accepting limitations rather than pursuing empire. But such rationality had been impossible within Japanese political and military culture of the 1930s. The military had seized control of government. Nationalist ideology demanded expansion. The emperor system made questioning strategic decisions nearly treasonous. Officers who might have urged caution feared being labeled cowards or traitors. The institutional structure guaranteed strategic decisions would be made by those most committed to expansion and least willing to acknowledge limitations. Japan had built a system that could start wars but could not avoid them, and could not end them short of complete destruction. The occupation of Japan by American forces after the war forced a final confrontation with the reality Japanese leadership had denied for years. American soldiers, sailors, and administrators arrived not as conquerors sowing destruction, but as organizers implementing reconstruction. The same industrial and organizational capacity that had crushed Japanese military forces was now being applied to rebuilding Japanese society. Roads were repaired, infrastructure rebuilt, industries restarted. The efficiency was humbling. General Douglas MacArthur, commanding the occupation, implemented reforms that transformed Japanese government, economy, and society. The speed and thoroughness of these changes demonstrated yet again what American organizational capacity could achieve. Japan had fought for years to preserve a system that Americans dismantled and reconstructed in months. The occupation was not gentle or uncontroversial, but it was effective in ways that forced Japanese observers to acknowledge American capabilities extended beyond military might to encompass social organization and economic management. Former Admiral Soemu Toyoda, observing occupation policies, found himself grudgingly respecting the same efficiency that had defeated Japanese forces. Americans approached reconstruction with the same systematic thoroughness they had applied to destruction. Problems were analyzed, solutions implemented, results measured, adjustments made. This was the same methodology that had enabled American industry to produce at unprecedented rates.
The skills that built carriers and bombers were now building roads and schools. The capacity that had overwhelmed Japanese military forces was now rebuilding Japanese society. The psychological adjustment required of Japanese people was profound. Citizens had been taught that Americans were decadent, weak, and racially inferior. Occupation forces demonstrated that Americans were efficient, organized, and remarkably competent. The cognitive dissonance was severe. How could the enemy be simultaneously defeated villains and capable administrators? How could the nation that firebombed cities now be providing food aid? The contradictions forced recognition that wartime propaganda had been lies, that Japanese understanding of America had been fundamentally flawed. Lieutenant Commander Haruki Aiki, the destroyer officer who had watched his ship rot in port for lack of fuel while American vessels operated freely offshore, found employment after the war, helping rebuild Japan's merchant marine. Working with American advisors, he learned industrial management techniques that Japanese industry had never developed. Standardization, quality control, systematic training, efficiency analysis. These were not revolutionary concepts, but they were being applied with thoroughness Japanese industry had never achieved. Aiki came to understand that American industrial superiority was not merely a matter of resources or production capacity, but of systematic approach to manufacturing and organization. America had applied scientific management to warfare with devastating effectiveness. The same principles were now being applied to reconstruction. Japan could learn these techniques and implement them. Indeed, Japanese industry would eventually adopt and perfect many American management methods, leading to economic success that exceeded even wartime industrial achievements. The reformation of Japanese military into the self-defense forces represented another confrontation with wartime miscalculations. The new military was designed around defensive capability,
and operated under strict constitutional limitations. Many former officers found this humiliating, a rejection of warrior traditions that had defined Japanese military identity for centuries. But others recognized that the old system had led to disaster, that the warrior culture had been corrupted into imperialism, that military dominance of government had been catastrophic. Admiral Soemuki Toyoda, testifying before the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, struggled to explain how intelligent, educated officers had pursued strategies that were obviously futile. His testimony revealed the cognitive traps that had ensnared Japanese leadership. Initial successes had created overconfidence. Institutional culture made questioning strategic assumptions dangerous. The emperor system made changing course politically impossible. Military dominance of government meant decisions were made by those least qualified to make them. The system had been designed to produce tactical victories, but was incapable of achieving strategic wisdom. The final accounting of the war revealed losses that staggered even those who had lived through the conflict. Over 2.5 million Japanese military personnel killed. Over 800,000 civilians dead from bombing, starvation, and disease. Millions more wounded, displaced, or traumatized. Entire cities destroyed. An empire dissolved. The nation occupied by foreign forces for the first time in its history. The cost of strategic miscalculation could hardly have been higher short of complete extinction. American losses, while significant and deeply mourned in America, were substantially smaller despite fighting a global war on multiple fronts. Over 100,000 American military personnel died in the Pacific War. This represented genuine sacrifice and caused real suffering to families and communities across America. But from a strategic perspective, these casualties had not prevented America from achieving total victory while simultaneously defeating Germany and supporting allies worldwide. America had absorbed losses that would have crippled Japan and continued operations without strategic degradation. The disparity in loss ratios revealed the fundamental asymmetry of the conflict. Japan had committed virtually its entire military capability to the Pacific War and lost. America had committed a portion of its military capability to the Pacific while simultaneously fighting in Europe and won decisively. The mathematical advantage had been so overwhelming that outcome had been predetermined once America mobilized fully. Every battle, every campaign, every operation after 1942 had simply been working through the inevitable conclusion. Captain Toshikazu Omai, whose dismissed reports on American shipbuilding had proven conservative rather than pessimistic, spent his post-war career teaching naval history at Japan's National Defense Academy. His lectures emphasized the importance of accurate intelligence and honest assessment. He taught students that courage and skill were valuable but insufficient against overwhelming material disadvantage. He stressed that understanding your opponent was more important than believing in your own superiority. His core message was that wars were won or lost in industrial capacity and logistics long before the first shots were fired. Former Admiral Suemu Toyoda, in a 1962 interview, acknowledged that the post-war alliance with America had achieved more for Japan than the wartime Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere ever could have. American partnership had enabled Japanese economic reconstruction, provided security guarantees, facilitated access to global markets. Japan had achieved prosperity and influence through cooperation that would have been impossible through conquest. The empire that Japan fought to create had been an illusion. The partnership that emerged from defeat was real and beneficial. This recognition required profound psychological adjustment from officers who had dedicated their lives to defeating America. Former Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, speaking to a reunion of naval veterans in 1968, suggested that Japan had been fortunate that America proved magnanimous in victory. A different opponent might have responded to Japanese aggression with lasting occupation or economic punishment. America had instead helped Japan rebuild, integrated Japan into the global economy, and ultimately enabled Japanese prosperity. The nation that had terrified Korea in 1944 with its carrier strength became Japan's most important ally by 1960. The human dimension of this transformation was captured in numerous small moments. American and Japanese veterans meeting decades after the war, finding they could respect each other despite having tried to kill each other. Former enemies discovering shared experiences of fear, loss, and trauma. Recognition that individual soldiers and sailors on both sides had been trapped in a conflict created by strategic miscalculation and political failure. The warriors had not chosen the war, but they had borne its costs. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, the Pearl Harbor attack leader, became a Christian missionary after the war and spent decades promoting reconciliation between America and Japan. His transformation from warrior to peacemaker exemplified the psychological journey many Japanese veterans underwent. Fuchida came to believe that the war had been fundamentally wrong, that Japanese aggression had been unjustifiable, that the suffering inflicted had been criminal. His missionary work represented an attempt at personal redemption and contribution to peace. Not all veterans achieved such clarity or transformation. Many struggled with memories of friends lost, missions flown, orders obeyed. Some felt betrayed by leadership that had sent them into unwinnable conflict. Others maintained belief in the righteousness of their cause, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. The psychological landscape of Japanese veterans was complex and varied, but most ultimately acknowledged that the war had been a catastrophic mistake that should never be repeated. The children and grandchildren of those who fought inherited a Japan transformed by defeat. The post-war generation grew up in a nation that had rejected militarism, embraced democracy, and achieved economic success beyond anything the wartime empire might have produced. They lived in cities rebuilt from ruins, benefited from education systems reformed during occupation, and enjoyed prosperity enabled by American partnership. The legacy of the war was not the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, but a democratic, prosperous Japan allied with its former enemy. This outcome validated the warnings that Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had issued before Pearl Harbor. Yamamoto had predicted that attacking America would awaken a sleeping giant and fill it with terrible resolve. He had been precisely correct. American industrial capacity, once fully mobilized, had proven unstoppable. The carrier strength that shocked Vice Admiral Kurita at Leyte Gulf was only one manifestation of a productive capacity that exceeded anything Japan could match. The war had been lost before it began, decided by factors of industrial capacity and resource availability rather than courage or tactical skill. The final irony was that defeat had ultimately benefited Japan more than victory could have. The empire Japan fought to create would have been unsustainable, requiring constant military force to maintain control over unwilling populations. The costs of occupation would have exceeded any economic benefits. Japan would have remained isolated, militaristic, and ultimately vulnerable to the same forces of nationalism that drove Japanese expansion. Defeat forced transformation that created a more successful nation than empire ever could have. Lieutenant Commander Masatake Okumiya, reflecting in his 1975 memoir on what he had witnessed at Rabaul when American material abundance first became undeniable, concluded that the greatest tragedy was not Japan's defeat, but that defeat required such suffering to achieve. If Japanese leadership had understood American industrial capacity accurately before the war, if they had recognized that victory was impossible, millions of lives might have been saved on both sides. The war had been fought to prove what accurate assessment would have revealed without combat. Up next, you got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.